Hi everyone, it's Ed here. We're on summer hiatus, but with the record-setting wildfires that Canada has been experiencing this summer, we decided to produce a special summer edition of Energy versus Climate to dig into the topic. We were joined by Allison Karp, a molecular paleoecologist and postdoctoral fellow at Yale University and Brown University. Starting in July 2024, Allison will be joining David at the University of Chicago as an assistant professor in the Department of Geophysical Sciences. Her research uses fossil molecules preserved in sediments to examine how fire has changed across geologic timescales and the consequences of shifts in fire activity and global carbon cycling. We had a wide-ranging conversation with Allison about fire and climate change, including how much of this year's wildfires we can safely attribute to climate change. As usual, there are no easy answers, but we hope it will expand your thinking and understanding at a time when we're still struggling to get these fires under control. Our thoughts go out to all of those who've been forced out of their homes by fire. Now here's the show. So Allison, why don't we start? Maybe you can just give us a brief outline of your background and your research interests and why you're here with David, Sarah, and me talking about fire.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a paleofire ecologist and geochemist, and I'm interested in questions about how fire has changed its process on long timescales, so anywhere from thousands to millions of years, and how it's interacted with changing climate and ecosystems, and what that can tell us about what we might expect from changes in fire today.
So in pre-industrial times, before humans drastically altered the CO2 level in the atmosphere, what drove or impacted the changes in the frequency, intensity, and extent of wildfires?
Yeah, so fire is, in order to have a fire effectively, you basically need three things. You need an ignition source, so something to spark the fire. You need enough fuel to burn, so fuel loads, and that fuel has to be connected, right? So if you have patches of fuels but space between them, then the fire can't spread. It's that concept of fire breaks, right? And then finally, you need the moisture level in that fuel to be low enough that it's flammable enough to actually catch and move forward. So those are the three things that really determine if you're going to get fire spreading. And then all the things that we think about when we think about fire, like fire numbers of fire, how extreme the fire is, how much area the fire burns, all come out of those initial variables. So you can imagine that people and climate and vegetation all affect all three of those variables, or at least one or two of the variables, right? So ignition source can be something like lightning, which is controlled by, weather patterns and what time of year you get a big storm with a lot of lightning. And then that can also be affected by humans, right? So if people are setting fires, that's an ignition source. And people are a major ignition source of fires today, but not evenly spread. In some places, people are igniting more fires. In some places, they're more lightning ignited. And then things like fuel connectivity, people also affect that, right? So that can be affected by, climate and growing season and how much fuel you actually have, if it's a good growing season or bad growing season. But also if people are clearing or converting land, that certainly affects fuel connectivity. And then finally, fuel moisture is a really big one, especially when we think about fires in North American forests. So if the fuel is dry enough to actually catch and spread. And you can imagine that is going to be predominantly determined by the climate conditions that lead up to that fire season and during that fire season.
David, I want to put to you the question that is on many people's minds these days. Is climate change a driver of increases in frequency, intensity, and the extent of wildfires today? Yes or no?
I guess I'd say probably yes, but I defer on fire stuff to Allison, my colleague who will be joining me at Chicago. But I can say some general things about climate attribution. So let me start with the kind of most basic thing. When people say that say some of the recent warming of the Earth's temperature is due to climate change, the way that sort of operationally we try to understand that in climate science is essentially to run a climate model for, let's say, the last 150 years. And you run the climate model in a couple different cases. You run the climate model with things we know happen, like there's a record of volcanoes in the atmosphere and other factors like that that weren't human-driven. And then you run the model with and without human carbon dioxide or human emissions. So then you compare what the climate model looks like with and without human emissions of carbon dioxide to the observations of what actually happened. And you see that you can't explain a bunch of the warming of the last, say, half or third of a century without including the effect of CO2. CO2 is just one of the effects. There's also, of course, an aerosol cooling from human aerosol pollution mid-century likely cooled the planet and still does provide some cooling that offsets some of the warming. But the way we pull those things out are to look at these kind of climate change runs for a century and a half or so, where the climate is the average of the weather, and then we can see something about what fraction, and say quite authoritatively, I think with some high confidence, what fraction of, say, current warming is due to human influence. That's reasonably straightforward. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a rise of efforts to attribute individual events like heat waves or floods, big rainstorms, or fires to climate change. And that's harder and more methodologically challenged. On the one hand, you can read lots of stuff now about attribution science, and there's formal efforts now to allow very quick attribution so it could be used in the press, where you could say effectively this heat wave has a 72% chance of being more likely or being caused by the fact it was climate change. But while people call that science, my sense is a lot of the most thoughtful climate scientists have a lot of head scratching, and it's actually quite hard to do that right because it's hard to define the condition you're testing against. So in the case I gave you before, where you're just testing overall climate change, it's pretty easy. But when you try and set up a condition where you're looking for, say, a certain particular European heat wave, you got to define what the test case is for that heat wave in your climate model run. And that's not so easy to do. So I think generally, do we know that a bunch of high temperature and other extreme events are more due to human action? Yes. There's certainly something to the attribution science, but there are some pretty serious methodological head scratchers about exactly how to calculate probabilities for these unique events.
I'm glad we're unpacking attribution science, and we probably can do so more in a dedicated show later on. But Sarah, I'd love to get your color commentary take on that as well, because it seems now it's just generally accepted, and especially in media. Maybe I'm deluded by the progressive left media that just assumes that the increase that we've seen in Canada, and it's objectively true that more hectares have burned in Canada this year than any other year, and we're still really only in the early stages of the wildfire season. But you can say, well, this wildfire is attributed to climate change, that one isn't, just like you can't say this Category 5 hurricane is because of climate change, and that one isn't. But Sarah, what's your perspective on the frequency and severity of these extreme weather events and the attribution science?
Yeah, I'll add kind of two thoughts, and then I'd love to hear Allison's thoughts on the fires specifically. So one is just for folks that are maybe less familiar with the concept of attribution science, typically the goal is not to say, this event happened because of climate change, but as David kind of hinted at, to give a probability or an increase in probability. So this fire or this heat wave was made, X percent or X times more likely as a result of climate change. So it's slightly different from saying, this happened because of climate change or didn't. But of course, if you have a bunch of events that are 10 or 20 or 50 times more likely as a result of climate change, that gives you some sense. The other thing that I think is maybe new about or sort of is particularly tricky when it comes to attribution science, David mentioned, this, I wrote down the phrase, in the press, right? And this is a case where we have science that's happening at the same time that there's a lot of external interest on it as well, too. And, eventually as well is going to start to interact with the legal system as well, as we're, I think we're going to try to tackle this later in the new season too. But this question of, attribution science and what that means from a legal perspective for who might be responsible and who might be, legally and financially responsible. And all of these different kind of areas, whether we're talking about science or the media or the legal system, have different definitions of proof and different sort of, for things to sort of be true in those areas is really a different kind of thing. There's different tests for it. There's different kind of levels of certainty and stuff like that. So I think it's a messy space exactly because you have a collision also of different types of ways you're trying to answer that question for different purposes, whether it's the scientific purpose or, say, a legal purpose. And that raises a lot of those challenges. But I generally agree with the sort of underlying point that, when it comes to climate change and warming in general, I think there is quite a scientific consensus. I think there's still debate around some of the science of the attribution. But my sense is that there's still, a clear directional kind of movement towards, yes, we can say something about, depending on how accurate that is, but something about how much more likely these given events are.
So, Allison, we're going to drag you into this debate willingly or unwillingly. Listen, we know you're a paleoecologist and you're looking at the ancient history of fire going back 420 million years, but we dragged you into this conversation to learn more about fire, but also, as we're wont to do on energy versus climate, to try to separate fact from fiction. So in your opinion, how much of this year's wildfires can we reasonably attribute to climate change?
Right. Well, I think Sarah made a really good point, as well as David, about what is the baseline you're testing against when you're thinking about, is this a significant change? And the reason that matters with fire is because fire in post-European settlement in North America versus pre-European settlement was probably a very different thing. And especially in like the last, 20th century and pre-fire policies in North America were generally very fire suppression oriented, right? So we would prevent fires from spreading and put fires out. Something we refer to sometimes as like the Smokey the Bear campaign in the U.S., right? Only you can stop wildfires. So there was this general shift in, the late 20th century that maybe this isn't the best way to manage fire. And the problem is that you suppress fires for hundreds of years. That really changes things like fuel loads and buildup, and the setting that the system was pre or post that is going to be really different. So there's certainly a component of like, okay, so is this abnormal when we compare it to the last 200 years or the last 1,000 years or the last 5,000 years? That baseline really matters. So I think that's where some paleoecology comes in, right? Because we can try to understand what regime was, pre-historical records. So that's helpful. But then the other piece of that too is that we do know that a lot of things that components that drive fire, as I mentioned earlier, right, are things that are related to climate conditions, like how dry it is and what the temperature is and, the persistence of some of those conditions. And so for fire, right, it's additionally tricky because it's a repeating process. So, we're talking about the size of the fire, the extremity of the fire, but also like how often we have big fires. And that has changed a lot in these systems too.
So, Allison, let's put that wicked question to you. Is climate change to blame for all the wildfires we're seeing this summer? And specifically, is Canada to blame for all the smoke that you're having to deal with in the United States?
Well, as David mentioned before, it's hard to attribute a single event to particular climate variables, but we can focus on the body of research that's looked at trends, especially trends in burned area through time in Western North America. And so what a lot of that work has done is a similar process to the attribution models David described earlier, but focusing in on climate variables that we know are very highly related to burned area in these systems. So one of those is something that we call vapor pressure deficit, which takes into account the humidity at a particular temperature. So it both incorporates humidity and temperature as variables. So what we found, what this work has found, is that there are really strong correlations between annual burned area and increases in annual burned area and increasing vapor pressure deficit or increasing heat and aridity. And so what attribution scientists have done then is run those models to try to understand how anthropogenic contributions to CO2 and anthropogenic warming are contributing to those trends in vapor pressure deficit, which are then contributing to those trends in increased burned area. And what a bunch of studies that have been released in the last 4 years or so have really shown is that we're looking at a half to 2/3 of that being attributed to anthropogenic warming. And so, there's other variables that, as I mentioned before, that affect fire. So things like ignitions and fuel loads also have a role to play as well. But in terms of wildfires in the Western United States, there is a body of work that does show that these conditions are definitely one of the things that we can point to show that these extreme fires are a result of. That isn't to say that a legacy of mismanagement and fire suppression hasn't also contributed, but there are strong statistical indications that climate change is at least partially to blame.
So it sounds like there is an answer, which is, maybe blame Canada a little bit, but more broadly blame, the world and whoever is, together responsible for climate change when it comes to the fires.
Yeah. There's a lot of blame to go around, I guess.
But isn't the answer very roughly half or a little bit more than half? So my understanding, like Allison's, is that this attribution question is that the increase in fire in Western U.S., something like half or a little more than half is attributable to climate change. So to think about how this has been played out in the press, there was an NPR story from a few years ago where there were wildfires in California, and Trump blamed forest management, and Biden blamed climate change. And the, I think, kind of liberal press reported this as Trump denies science. My view is both sides were kind of ignoring the science, which in fact says that both factors matter. So there have been these systematic changes in forest management that are a significant driver of the change in fire frequency. And so what Trump was saying was the factor was in fact part of the factor. And climate change is in fact part of the factor. So what Biden was saying was part of the factor, but both of them were giving a one-sided answer that in fact is not a fair representation of what we know about fire.
I just put the asterisk on that around. And to say, yes, I think I agree with you. And I think that comes back to, what we love to talk about on this show, that people like to simplify the answer. And, part of that is maybe because once you start to give the more complex answer, you worry that, certain people will jump onto just one side of it. I guess I would just put the asterisk that, I think there are some major differences, and I'm way outside of my area of expertise here, but between, forest management and the management of some of the Canadian forests, which, a lot of those areas, my understanding is that they're unmanaged. So there may be, if we were to, I guess we'll have to wait a little while for the peer review process and for all these questions to be asked about the forest fires that we have in Canada. But, as you well know, David, they are very big spaces, and many of them are not actively managed.
Interesting. So less fire suppression here. Yeah, I don't know. Good question. I don't know the answer. And Allison, you probably don't know either, but you can guess.
I don't know for Quebec specifically. But a lot of these fires are in very remote locations. The ones this summer, right? And so. It's certainly a bit of a different conversation than, when we talk about the fires in California that are like burning down people's homes. It's just, the management is different. And part of that is the remoteness of the location. Part of it's that there's like different types of forests, things like that, different historical policies. So, fire is complex. It's different everywhere that you talk about it, in every context under, different state and national forestry system. So it is certainly a complex topic,
and it's become incredibly politicized, as we're touching upon. Generally here, and listening to the three of you as scientists unpacking the straightforward question, is climate change a driver of the increased frequency and severity and extent of wildfires? And if I could characterize all three of your answers, it's yes, it depends, a half to 2/3, and that is definitely not a media-friendly answer these days when, to your point, Sarah, that media wants to dumb things down. On this show, you're right, we don't want to dumb things down. We want to make it more complex. But you could see the conversation that we just had. If you had folks on the right of the political spectrum and the left of the political spectrum listening in, they could spin it for their objectives based on what we've said entirely. They could spin it two ways. And you add to it, not just as the attribution of to climate change of forest fires now become politicized, the very causes of them. I've just come from the Yukon, drove through parts of northeast BC, drove by the Liard River fire in the Upper Peace. It was the worst smoke I've ever driven through before, and at times I thought I'd need to pull over just because of the smoke, because the visibility was so poor. And 300 fires are burning in BC. 30% of them were caused in the past 36 hours because they had lightning strikes. And that seems pretty clear. It seems that we can objectively say, when you have a bunch of lightning, then that's going to cause fires, even if we're not sure climate change is accountable for 2/3 of that or 1/2 of that. In our province, we can't even get to the cause of the fire without it being politicized. We had our premier recently say, well, it's not lightning strikes that have caused these fires, it's arsonists, and is bringing in a bunch of investigators to pinpoint the arsonists who have set all these terrible wildfires. So it's like so many things today to do with science and technology and policy, we're actually falling into this disinformation and misinformation trap, which then says, well, what can we actually do when people are getting burnt out of their homes? How can we actually get at the true causes and come up with the right mitigations for it? Which is where I want to take us today. And Canada has been, on the main page of the New York Times for all the wrong reasons. Blame Canada because we're sending down our smoke. But also recently, the New York Times was saying, hey, Canada is a good case study of the economic toll of wildfires. And maybe, Allison, I know your research goes much further back than, the impact on human civilization, but maybe you could still give us a sense of, what are the social and economic and health implications of wildfires today, and especially looking ahead, if they are increasing, what can we expect in the future?
Yeah, well, the biggest, we talk about the smoke and how that's really made headlines in the news, but air quality is certainly a big one, and the health impacts of that. So, the big concern is PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that's 2.5 microns or smaller. So it's small enough to get into your lungs, and that can cause all sorts of respiratory and heart issues. And so, dealing with that in areas that have traditionally not had that type of air pollution, had to deal with it, is certainly a big one. In terms of, are there behavioral changes that we need to be making? Are there technology solutions to that? The reality is that if, there are more fires happening and they're burning through fuels that are, have a propensity to produce this type of pollution, then certainly something we need to be concerned about for the future. And then, there's people's lives and livelihoods, property damage, communities that are affected as well. So, that is also something to consider, especially when we think about places that people are building new developments. So thinking about fire risk and insuring against fire. This is a big conversation topic, especially in places like California. That is, something that I think is on a lot of people's minds to consider as well.
Gotcha. And again, one story just from my recent trip to the north, the road to Fort Liard in northeast BC in the Upper Peace region has been closed for a week, Highway 77. If you want to go to there from Fort Nelson, it's a 200-kilometer, 2-hour drive. The alternate route from Fort Nelson requires a 19-hour, 1,700-kilometer counterclockwise route to get there. So Fort Liard has been cut off from the south. It's a place where there's oil and gas operations, you harvest timber, and right now, none of that can happen. Sarah, where you're at in Calgary, and the eye that you pay attention particularly to what drives Alberta's economy and the oil and gas economy especially, what are some of the impacts specific to Alberta that we need to worry about? And maybe also, how has that become politicized, especially when it touches upon oil and gas operations?
Gosh, well, like Allison said, there's so many, right? I mean, we certainly had examples of operations that were directly shut in or threatened to be shut in as a result of fires burning in Alberta this year. So you have that direct impact on economic activity. We also, had a few really bad smoke days here in Calgary. And I think it really, to me, it underscores just kind of how unprepared we really are to deal with some of these impacts and them becoming real. The health piece, I think, it starts to, the PM 2.5 starts to kind of show where, our buildings and our spaces are not well set up to deal with this kind of pollution and keeping people safe. I guess I'll just put a plug for all of our listeners, hopefully know that when those air quality days are really bad, wearing masks is a really good way to protect yourself. And that PM 2.5 is really not something that you want to mess around with in terms of it getting into your lungs and even into your brain. And so, this can be scary stuff, and it's really wise to take steps to protect yourselves. But that is, there's only so much with that, right? And it starts to then impact, my kids are soccer players, and the Soccer Association now has an official ruling of when the air quality is worse than a 7 on the 10-point scale, all games are canceled. And that certainly has happened quite a bit more this year, I think, than ever before. Which I think also, on the one hand, we're having to learn to deal with some of these new issues that I think are going to just also further exacerbate underlying inequalities when it comes to, people being able to protect themselves personally or be working in spaces that are not exposed to this smoke. But at the same time, I think we're also starting to see some of this so-called, shifting baseline syndrome that David Roberts wrote a really nice summary article on, highlighting research from Francis Moore as well as others. Dr. Moore looked at this question of kind of remarkability of temperature abnormalities, and the fact that, people sort of, you adjust your baseline. And so the first, somewhere in the first 2 to 6 years where you have these, really, really hot days, for example, everybody is really sort of surprised by them and talks about them a lot. And after that time, that actually, they find that declines. So after that period of, call it 5 years, people just sort of start to feel like, well, that's normal and that's the new normal. And as humans, we have this ability, this kind of psychological ability to adapt to changing situations, even ones that are getting worse, that, one can imagine how that's protective. But I think, anecdotally in conversations that I've had, it seems that that's starting to happen with the smoke. The first really bad smoke year we had, which was about maybe 5 years ago, was really shocking. And I feel like this year people start to say, well, I guess this is just what it's like in the summer in Alberta, and we got to, accept that there's going to be these smoke days. So there's, I think we're seeing some of these things playing out in real time when it comes to the fires.
Sure. And we here in the West have been dealing with it, like you say, for about half a decade now. And some will say, well, we have not 4 seasons, we have 5 seasons each year, and that 5th season is the fire season. I will say it became, I think, particularly newsworthy, not just because the extent of hectares that have been burnt in Canada at such an early stage in the fire season, but the fact that you had major eastern cities like Toronto, like DC, like New York City dealing with smoke. And that's what got it into the New York Times.
Yeah.
That's what got us to blame Canada. It got Allison on this show because it's one thing for it to happen in Calgary or Vancouver or Seattle. It's another thing when it happens in New York City. David, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, just to say that the particulate matter impacts are pretty real. There's a kind of amazing new paper from Marshall Burke's group that's one of the sort of top econometric groups that works on climate change. And they show that the fraction of overall PM exposure that's due to fire has increased from really a kind of small number of 10% or a few percent up towards, in Western U.S., up towards half or a third. And that's a really kind of pretty stunning fact. And if you think that half of that is due to climate or more, then that's a really significant climate impact. And just to be clear, overall, of course, PM levels have declined in North America because of pollution controls. And that's been adding to people's lives. The Clean Air Act has sort of added about a year to, or even 2 years to an average person's life, which is a huge win. And now we see that increasing smoke could actually reverse some of that. And that's a really large impact. And I think people need to take it seriously, both for policy, but also in their own lives. And think carefully about actually spending more time inside or in a place with filters or wearing masks in days that have high smoke. It's not just inconvenience, it really is very unhealthy.
All right, I think we'll leave it at that for this special summer edition of Energy versus Climate. Allison Karp, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinijescu. Thanks to Hannah Tai, Priya Kunikulato, and Crystal Hickey for their production support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. You can also send your feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. We'll be back in September with Season 5 of Energy versus Climate. See you then.